Thank you, Acting Speaker. I rise to speak in support of the Drugs, Poisons and Controlled Substances Amendment authorising Pharmacists Bill of 2023. In doing so, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the work of the Minister for Health, her office, the Department in preparing this bill, and I would also like to acknowledge the contributions of all the previous members in this debate, including particularly the member for Northcote's contribution, which I found quite compelling. However, I would also like to begin by stating that I'm very proud to be part of the Labor Party that has always fought to uphold the promise of universal access to healthcare. Regardless of one's postcode, bank balance or circumstance, Labor has always been a strident defender of the community's right to access public healthcare and medicines. Whether it was the creation of Medibank under the Whitlam government, the creation of Medicare under the Hawke government, or the establishment of the NDIS under the Rudd-Gillard governments, or whether it was laying the foundations for the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme in 1944 under the Curtin wartime government, which I will touch on shortly on, the fact is Labor's DNA is ingrained in the roots and origins of what is today's universal public health system in Australia. But while Medicare tends to receive a lot of the public attention when it comes to the public health policy debate, and rightly so, I would like to draw the House's attention to the origins of the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme, especially given that we are debating a bill that focuses on the role and the future of Victorian pharmacies in our local communities. In this respect, I draw the House's attention to a publication in the Australian Medical Journal of August 2014 by Marty S. Goddard, which eloquently outlines the origins and the politics around the creation and evolution of the PBS. The article outlines how nearly 80 years ago now, the Curtin Labor wartime government first introduced legislation for a PBS in response to the need for and the provision and supply of a wave of new antibiotic drugs, including penicillin, for the whole population, not just the minority who could afford them at the time. To quote Marty Goddard from the Journal article, on the 11th of February 1943, Chifley introduced the government's financial statement, the main item of which was a national welfare scheme, which was the central element of the post-World War reconstruction program. It was the most ambitious welfare program to be introduced by an Australian government. However, the Conservative opposition at the time had a problem. They were against the notion of universal welfare because they believed it contradicted the central tenet of 19th century liberalism, the supremacy of the individual. But the welfare measures introduced to a community traumatised by 15 years of economic depression and war were overwhelmingly popular with the electorate, with the October 1943 Morgan Gallup poll showing 76% supported universal healthcare. So in February 1944, the Pharmaceutical Benefits Bill was introduced into the Federal Parliament as part of this broader package, allowing for any Australian resident to be entitled on presenting a doctor's prescription to a pharmacist to be given medicine at no charge. The pharmacist would be reimbursed by the government and there would be a list of approved medications to ensure quality and effectiveness, which would be drawn up by an expert committee. A fair and reasonable proposition, Acting Speaker, being introduced by a fair and responsible National Party of government at the time. However, from the get-go, the proposed scheme was immediately and successfully opposed and undermined by the then Conservative opposition and their Conservative allies at the time, including through 2 High Court challenges, 2 referendums, a constitutional amendment which sought to limit the PBS's reach and application, and even then limiting the PBS to only a small number of expensive and life-saving drugs from the moment that the then new Health Minister in the Menzies government was sworn in on the 9th of January 1950. They didn't waste a moment. And because of these historic actions and resistance by the then Conservatives, it was actually not until 1960, well over a decade after the scheme was originally conceived by the Curtin Labor government, that Australians eventually had access and benefited from the comprehensive PBS and originally envisaged scheme as set out by the Curtin Labor government. As described by Mr Goddard, and I quote, as scientists and manufacturers continued to race to develop new drugs, the Menzies government limited PBS list became increasingly inadequate, with the realities of scientific progress and the basic sense of social fairness shared in different ways by both sides of politics, which eventually combined with the Liberals finally realising Labor's longer and larger PBS scheme. But it would be left to later Labor governments to complete the task of providing healthcare, including via Medicare. Speaker, does any of this sound familiar? Whether it was in the 1940s or 50s when the Liberals delayed action to introduce a fully fledged PBS scheme, or whether it was a decade of ignoring the science and delaying action on climate change from 2013 to 2021 under the Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison governments, or more recently, whether it was the Liberals joining forces with the Greens in Canberra to delay a vote on the Albanese Labor government's Housing Australia Future Fund bill until October, or even in this very chamber today, where the Liberal Nationals have moved an amendment to this bill by stating in their amendment, and I quote, that this bill should be withdrawn and redrafted. Speaker, the record clearly shows that while Labor has always sought to govern with vision and conviction to make a real difference to the lives of working people, others have simply been happy to just ride on the sheep's back while blocking, delaying and obstructing. Whether it was in the 1940s or even today, in this very day, in 2023, Acting Speaker, you just can't trust the Liberals in government to do the right thing. And Speaker, if we are talking about the future of our health system, including opportunities around the future role of pharmacies in the health system, it's fundamental to look at this history and which side of politics has stood on the side of affordability and access to health care for our community, and that's always been Labor. Speaker, the election of the federal Albanese Labor government has now seen the Commonwealth urgently get to work, finally, on fixing a primary health care and Medicare system that has been experiencing unprecedented levels of distress and demand. After almost a decade of federal Liberal government's cuts and neglect, including through the devastating collapse in bulk billing on their watch, leaving behind a legacy of burgeoning demand on GPs, we now have more people than ever before turning to state emergency departments, hospitals and state-based services. In response and in stark contrast to the contempt the federal Liberals have shown for primary healthcare and Medicare, since 2014 the Andrews Labor government has been doing more than ever before to help Victorians get access to the healthcare they need when they need it. Along with building new hospitals and recruiting more nurses, other key initiatives the Andrews Labor government have been implementing to provide Victorians with accessible, responsive and agile health services include the establishment of priority care centres, a landmark state initiative that provides GP-led care to people who need urgent care, treating people with lower-level conditions such as fractures, burns and mould infections. The centres have already treated 50,000 patients just since September gone, seeing patients who otherwise would have had created more pressure on our emergency departments. Victoria's virtual emergency departments, our virtual EDs, are also playing a key role. First established as a pilot in October of 2020, the virtual EDs have treated over 85,000 people as of December 2022, allowing patients to be virtually assessed and referred on by emergency doctors and nurses, again freeing up our physical emergency departments. The establishment of Labor's 24/7 supercare pharmacies provide after-hours healthcare service and advice, treatment for a range of other minor injuries and illness as well, which my family and I have also made use of at the one in Coburg in Louisa Street. In this context, Acting Speaker, I welcome the measures contained in this Authorising Pharmacists Bill Amendment of 2023, which will see us expand the role of community pharmacists as part of a new 12-month trial. The 2023 Victorian budget invests $20 million to establish this pilot with this bill to amend the Drugs, Poisons and Controlled Substances Act of 1981 to allow more pharmacists to provide treatment and advice for common conditions and basic healthcare needs. The bill will create a new mechanism for pharmacists to be legally authorised to supply certain prescription medicines without a prescription and to enable community pharmacists to access the statewide pilot and participate. It will improve access to primary health care, particularly for women, and it will help ease pressure on GPs and hospitals, including the Northern, the Austin, the Royal Melbourne, the Royal Women's and the Royal Children's Hospital across Melbourne's north, with which many people in my electorate access and rely on. The pilot will provide community access for treatment for 3 select health condition and groups, including the continued supply of the oral contraceptive pill for women without a prescription, treatments of some kind of some mild skin conditions, and antibiotics for uncomplicated urinary tract infections, UTIs for women. Easier access to treatment for these conditions will assist many in our community, but it will particularly assist women, Acting Speaker. UTIs are the 3rd most common human infection, with around 12 to 15% of women being affected annually. Nearly 1 in 3 women require treatment for UTIs before they are of 24 years of age, which increases to around 1 in 2 women by the age of 32. When it comes to immunisations, pharmacists participating in the pilot will be authorised to administer select travel vaccines following the completion of additional training, support and resources being provided. Treatment and designated medications will be provided through clear and established protocols for identified health condition groups. This approach, known as structured prescribing under the National Health Professionals Prescribing Pathway Framework, is consistent with the New South Wales clinical trial and the Queensland UTI pilot. This approach enables the government and primary healthcare sector to assess the safety and effectiveness, and for the Victorian community to build trust in an alternative primary care pathway via pharmacies. The pilot is consistent with other reforms being progressed nationally across other Australian jurisdictions, as I touched on in New South Wales and Queensland. Acting Speaker, there's so much more to say on this bill, but essentially it's a bill that I commend to the House and it forms part of Labor's tradition to support the health sector.